Hey friends, there are a number of mistakes that DMs fall into, and though none of them is a poison needle trap, they still can make our games feel a little bit poisonous. My name's Timothy, and I'm a professional dungeon master running over 300 games a year. I've made all of these mistakes, and my hope is that today we'll be able to help you avoid a few of these problems so that you can run a better game of Dungeons & Dragons. Let's get to it. Most of us in the D&D space have at some time or another really enjoyed either saying or hearing the words, roll for initiative. Unfortunately, one of the traps that we tend to fall into with rolling initiative is requesting it just a little bit too soon. One reason that that's a problem is because when we roll for initiative, we are immediately breaking ourselves out of the narrative of the story and moving into the dicey mechanics portion of the game. Now, obviously, we're here to play the mechanic-y portion of the game as much as we're here for the narrative, and we want to have some fun at the table, rolling some dice and seeing awesome things occur. But if you transition too swiftly from one to the other, people tend to leave off options that should have still been available on the table. Have you ever had a fight that started out with a call for roll for initiative and somebody way down on the initiative list held their tongue because they had rolled so poorly, and when it finally got around to their turn, they gave in to the masses and continued to fight even though what they really wanted to do was call out a diplomatic option and parlay with the enemy that was arrayed against them. Because we roll initiative and we jump into that situation, those kinds of options tend to get filtered out by all but the most dedicated of our players who are striving to do so, and sometimes we start to fall into this trap of thinking that in initiative the only thing we can do is fight the enemy. Even though all other options remain on the table, when you break it down into a round by round, it doesn't feel like those are truly options anymore to go and investigate this, learn that, offer diplomatic solution, or intimidate the enemy into surrendering. Though we can put in the work to make those things still possible while we're in combat, typically a player's mindset is going to filter those things away from being still available. One way that you could avoid falling into this trap is to essentially avoid calling for initiative and instead state the triggering factor that you think is going to trigger initiative. For instance, say the Orcish chieftain grips his great axe tighter, raises it up, and he is preparing to charge. After stating this, normally we would call for roll for initiative, but instead we can ask our players, when you see this, what do you do? If we go around the table requesting information from each of the players about their intentions for this first round of the combat, essentially, then the player who has got an idea other than fighting will have a chance to say, I'd like to speak out and use my knowledge of the Orcish language and religion to suggest a reason why he shouldn't fight us. That option would probably not have happened if that person was at a 5 on the initiative count and was being missed out by everybody else. By giving that quick question around the table to find out everybody's intentions, not only do we make those things possible, but we also make the first round of combat that much faster as we then roll for initiative and narrate out what people were intending to do and offer them the chance to either take that action, which moves swiftly along, or to shift into another option. We essentially draw out that narrative pause at the very beginning and give everybody the chance to look in that individual moment and decide what they're going to do, and then we break out the gamey portion when the gamey portion is needed. The second mistake that we fall into as dungeon masters is to try and put every situation that comes to pass on a map. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and it's true. However, the one thing that they don't mention in that is that words can be interpreted by different minds in different ways and can create completely different pictures. When we put down a map for an interaction, what we're doing is constraining reality down to what can be seen. Sometimes the maps include lots of wonderful little details that people can grasp onto and bring out into their actions, and sometimes they are line maps like WotC has been sticking to, and they have no real details at all. While that does leave something up to their imagination, it tends to limit their creativity and encourage people not to see something from their own perspective. And while sometimes we want to have a gritty combat with turn-by-turn movement and all of the details factored in, often it's better and faster for us to run a quick theater of the mind encounter for an easy fight and let our players flex their creativity and their imagination imagination just a little bit more. In a dungeon environment, it is often true that a map is king, but it can get really tiresome when you're trying to move a bunch of little figures around your map or trying to have everybody control their own token in a virtual tabletop when not everybody is as invested in that particular medium. You're often going to find that you have somebody lagging 10 rooms behind because they didn't move their tokens since the last time initiative was rolled. One way to offset this is to use a party location token that suggests where everybody is, and then when the encounter happens and we finally go into initiative, give everybody the opportunity to choose where they would have been in the circumstance that arose. Don't worry too much about people cheesing this out. It's not going to make that much of a difference in the long run, and most of the time you're going to find that your players are very true to the image that's in their head, particularly for random encounters or easy encounters or encounters where it's many versus one and there aren't a bunch of different terrain options and unusual things for people to interact with. Consider running the encounter in theater of the mind and help your players to stretch their imaginations. When we use the grid, we are bound to that, and there's a certain degree of tyranny of the grid that takes place in a lot of DMs and a lot of players, where we end up being constrained by the 5 foot that we couldn't quite make, and we spend a lot of time waffling over the perfect action. By occasionally running something a little more fast and loose in theater of the mind, we loosen our players up a little to realize that it's not quite so important, and loosen our own grip, which gets a little too tight at times too. The third mistake the DMs often make is to not foreshadow or offer agency in situations involving things like traps. While this seems like it's a hallmark of the Gary Gygax era of D&D, which lots of people either love or hate, player versus DM sort of mentality and the gotcha feeling of I snuck this past you and you didn't see it coming, Gary Gygax, while he did seem to have that adversarial approach, it was an adversarial approach that was built on because of the players that he had and the relationship that they had forged. It wasn't necessarily something that caused anger back and forth at the table, but rather was a matter of him trying to really script out and figure out how things work and giving people the opportunity to unravel that. When they did, they got to feel super smart. When they didn't, he got to feel super smart. In our modern games, we don't usually have this kind of competition happening at our tables, and yet we still run traps where when somebody fails to get the information needed, they trip over a tripwire and immediately take the consequences with no options, no questions, and nothing to do with it. It's important that we provide opportunity to foreshadow so that our players could at least look back and say, that's why he mentioned the carving on the wall. I should have checked that out before we continued moving. That's why he mentioned how scrupulously clean this hallway was before I walked into the gelatinous cube. If we foreshadow by envisioning what the players would be able to see were they in their character's situation and telegraphing that to them, then it improves their experience 100% if they could at least look back and find it, and sometimes they get to look forward and discover and fulfill that itch for exploration and be excited at their own ingenuity. Another method that we can use to avoid the gotcha feeling is the click method that I first saw from Angry GM over on his blog. Essentially, when something happens that would trigger a trap and cause the bad outcome that your player is not looking forward to, freeze the action right there, give a foreshadowing of the danger that is to come. Maybe it's the sound of the floor panel depressing down into the click of a sprung trap and a whoosh of air as something is being propelled. Then you ask the player, what do you do? Their immediate reaction might be something simple like, I try to dodge out of the way, at which point they get their usual saving throw. Or it could be something like, I swing my shield to the left side to try to defend myself, and maybe they'll get advantage because of their quick thinking and their reading of the cue. Giving that little click moment allows them to have that tiniest piece of agency left in the situation, and even though they're still going to be in a bad spot, and they're still going to have the gotcha feeling of I stepped on this trap that I hadn't found, it allows them to feel like they are acting in part of the trap and having agency instead of just being acted upon by the trap. The list of mistakes that I've made at the table is pretty much endless. I'd love to hear what mistakes you've seen at the table or made yourself, so feel free to leave that in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks so much for watching, and happy adventuring. Maybe it's the sound of the floor plan. Oh. Maybe it's the sound of the Maybe it's the sound of the floor panel